Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. Today it is Short Story Tuesday, and I wanted to talk about a short story I read that has a bit of a spooky flavor because it is October, a month for spooky things. So I wanted to highlight, at least in the short stories that I read, something spooky, because last year I had read, all spooky things for both books and short stories, and it felt like too much. So I think short stories is just fine for the month of October. And so I wanted to talk about a short story about a missing woman and a spooky ghost story of sorts. I am referring to The Invisible Girl by Mary Shelley. For those who don't know, and much like when I was talking about Poe, I think it'd be difficult to find people who don't know about Mary Shelley. But Mary Shelley was an author in the 1800s, most famously known for Frankenstein or The Modern Prometheus. I do like that other title that she added on there. I think it's a pretty interesting there. And a lot of people just know her for writing Frankenstein, but she wrote so many other things, children's stories, essays, as well as short stories. Last year I talked about The Mortal Immortal, which is a fantastic short story. Go read it and then watch the video I made on it, because it's one of the better short stories that I've read on this channel. But today I'm going to be talking about The Invisible Girl. So without further ado, let's talk about it. I will do a brief summary, a little bit of an analysis, and we will move on from there. So The Invisible Girl starts with an unnamed narrator entering a sort of rundown castle to get out of the rain. They're met by some sort of caretaker lady who is offering them shelter for the night. When the narrator spots a painting on the wall that is most unusual. If you watched my video on The Oval Portrait last week by Edgar Allan Poe, you might notice that it has a similar vibe there, which I thought was funny. But yeah, the narrator notices the Invisible Girl painting and asks about it to the caretaker, who then relays the rest of this story here. So there's a village, and this man shows up who everyone recognizes as Henry Vernon, the son of a pretty wealthy lord in the area. He recruits some sailors to cross some water, and it begins to rain, a pretty heavy storm, and the sailors are fearing for their own lives at this point. But thankfully, a lighthouse beacon pops up, one that the sailors note is pretty unusual because the lighthouse is sort of out of the way and run down, and so people suspect that a ghost might be running it or something like that. And when they get to the lighthouse, as Henry is sailing across the water, they discover that at least on the ground floor there is no lighthouse keeper at this time. No one to answer the door, no one. So it's a bit unusual, and they all decide to rest for the night and go back during the day to fix up the boat and make repairs and everything like that. It's at this point that Henry reflects on what has made him so bitter at this point, because he used to be so happy, but he's kind of bitter now. And we learned that Henry grew up in his house with an orphan. His father had taken in an orphan when they were both young, and Henry made friends with this orphan and actually fell in love with her. Her name was Rosina. But both Henry and Rosina felt that Henry's dad, Sir Peter, would take offense to this relationship, so they hid it as much as possible. And they eventually tried to set up both Rosina and Henry with other people. But Rosina wrote letters to Henry saying that she didn't want that sort of relationship. She just wanted to be with Henry. And unfortunately, someone intercepted the letter and told Sir Peter. And he threatened Rosina by telling her to stay away from his heir, or something really bad was going to happen to her. And she ended up running away. And Sir Peter felt a little bit guilty because all of these were idle threats. He loved Rosina. He just didn't want her to be with Henry because of the scandal that might ensue there. And they couldn't find Rosina at this point. Henry comes home from overseas, learns about this, and mourns Rosina a little bit, but sets out to try to find her, which is where he is at this point in the story. While back at the lighthouse, he finds a slipper, causing him to think a little bit about Cinderella, thinking it might actually belong to the invisible woman who sort of haunts this lighthouse, as told by the locals. And he makes his way upstairs to see if there's anybody, like either a ghost or a human being, living in this lighthouse. And he hears some disembodied breathing, and he speaks out, and the voice replies back to him, which he recognizes as Rosina. It's a disembodied voice, so he can't really, he can feel Rosina by hugging her, but he can't really tell if she's there or not, causing him to momentarily, doubt, is she even alive or not? But they eventually make it outside, and he can see that, yes, indeed, she is still alive, although she is a little ill because she's been living in the wilderness for the past couple of days. They end up getting married and live in the castle where they first met for a short period of time. And the story kind of ends there on a happy note. In terms of analysis, there is a bit to talk about with this story. One thing that comes up, and I feel like every time I talk about, a Poe story or a Mary Shelley story, I end up talking about this, but there's a gothic atmosphere within this story. There's talk of ghosts, haunting the lighthouse, or just people who have died and who have an effect on the story somehow. And then again, the castle at the beginning of the story and also the lighthouse are both run down and described as a bit creepy. They're derelict, and what does that invite? It invites more ghosts, more rumors, more spooky stuff as you try to navigate these areas. Even the portrait of Rosina that is described in the story is described a little bit unusually. Let me read it to you and try to see if you can capture anything there. She was reading one of those folio romances which have long been the delight of the enthusiastic and young. Her mandolin was at her feet, her paroquet perched on a huge mirror near her. The arrangement of furniture and hangings gave token of a luxurious dwelling, and her attire also evidently that of home and privacy, yet bore with it an appearance of ease and girlish ornament, as if she wished to please. Beneath the picture was inscribed in golden letters, "The Invisible Girl." And I find that to be interesting because this painting that the narrator is looking at in this story, it seems like all of that combines to show a person of high class and esteem, a pretty fancy, nice, wonderful person. They have everything going for them. And then below it is described, the invisible girl, kind of dark, ominous. Why is this person described that way? It makes you think. And so I feel like it adds, it kind of lends the high class and the gothic together in a very unusual way, which I got to give Mary Shelley credit for. It's pretty interesting. Another interesting element of the story is that of the theme of resolution. Resolution comes into play after Rosina runs away. There's no body found for Rosina, which puts immense guilt on Sir Peter, Henry's father. But there's also, a bit of sadness with Henry, and he sets about trying to find Rosina, because for him, he wants to see either Rosina or a dead body. He wants there to be resolution. And I think at multiple points throughout the story, the sailors talk of a ghost haunting the lighthouse because of, the ghost is there because of a of their sailor love who drowned at sea or whatever. And it's interesting that they bring that up, because there's also, a need for unfinished business resolution with these ghosts. Like, they still have something, keeping them tethered to this plane. And when Henry goes inside the lighthouse, he encounters a slipper, which, like, he compares to Cinderella. And so when the prince finds the slipper in Cinderella, like, he puts it on Cinderella's foot, and that brings the resolution. That makes her fully like a princess or a queen in this new kingdom. At least, in the modern telling. I don't know what was going on in Mary Shelley's time with that story, but it's interesting that she does, bring or mention Cinderella a little bit, because the prince was looking for resolution in that story, and to some extent Henry is trying to bring resolution with the slipper too, because he starts to take it upstairs, and I think to some extent he wants to take it to the ghost, so that maiden, the widower who he believes to be there, might experience some resolution too. But he also notes that it's Rosina's size. So with that, you get that maybe if he goes upstairs, he might find Rosina's body, and that'll bring him the resolution that he wants around her death. So resolution seems to be a big part of this story, and ultimately Henry gets it. But for the imaginary ghost that the sailors were talking about in this story, that imaginary ghost didn't get their resolution. As I'm sure with, a lot of other Mary Shelley stories, like a lot of the characters don't really get the resolution they want. And the last thing I want to talk about is the idea of truth. And essentially, is any of this true in this story? There's a lot that's being said in this story that causes me to question, whether any of this is true, whether someone in it is lying. Allow me to read you a quote from the beginning. This slender narrative has no pretensions on the regularity of a story or the development of situations and feelings. It is but a slight sketch, delivered nearly as it was narrated to me by one of the humblest of the actors concerned. Nor will I spin out of its circumstances interestingly, principally from its singularity and truth, but narrate as concisely as I can how I was surprised on visiting what seemed a ruined tower, crowning a bleak promontory overhanging the sea that flows between Wales and Ireland, and it just goes on from there. But I do find it interesting how the narrator starts the story by saying they're not gonna, make any embellishments to it, but tell it as it was told to me, and just they're not gonna, again, they're not gonna embellish it. But I have the question, like, why do they feel the need to emphasize that? And why are you telling me that you're telling it as it was told to you? And I think what this means is the narrator kind of doesn't believe the story as it's happening, like, or the story that they were told. Like, maybe they think it's like, kind of BS to some extent, and so they're passing that on to us and saying, like, I was told this story, it might be true, it might not, I'm telling it to you. And so it's entirely possible that the events in this story are lies, that this is just a local legend, or, that the story never even happened at all. And the host for this narrator, as they're staying in this castle, is just, spinning them a yarn to have a little fun. But I do think it's kind of interesting, because it kind of puts doubts immediately with this story by having the narrator come out and saying, hey, this story was told to me. It reminds me of Mark Twain, who was known for, frequently lying in stories, and like the celebrated jumping frog of Calaveras County, like that was a story told to the narrator as well. And like, these are two different genres, but it's still interesting how that plays out. And another thing that stands out to me with the story that causes me to doubt a few things is the happy ending. Like, Henry just finds Rosina, they get married, and everything's great, and that feels a little wonky for how the story like is set up. Like, it's set up to make you kind of think like this is going to lead to him discovering someone's body, or like it's going to lead to, Henry discovering a ghost and never actually finding the resolution he needs with Rosina. So again, you could wonder, like, is somebody embellishing this tale to maybe altering the ending to suit their needs to tell a bit of a happier story? I don't know. I think that's left up to the reader. It might just be bad writing on Mary Shelley's part, but I do have to think this is somewhat intentional, especially given the competence of someone like Mary Shelley. I'll leave it up to you. Like, do you think this is somewhat of a lie? Do you think it's somewhat true? Sound off in the comments below. I would love to hear from you. And then, yeah, as I mentioned before, like, this is Mary Shelley. She's a competent writer. But there's also a specific style with Mary Shelley as she's been writing. Like, you've seen it in Frankenstein, how it's kind of a dark and sad story. And The Immortal, like, that's kind of dark and sad too, because the narrator is going to live forever and he can't possibly share that with anyone. And in this story, it ends too happily, and like, that stands out to me because it's a Mary Shelley story. Like, this could be her trying something different, but I have to feel like maybe to some extent the ending is, a misrepresentation of what's happening. Either someone's lying and altering the story, or, someone's deluding themselves into a fantasy in telling the story. I don't know which one it is, but it is interesting how like I'm thinking about this, and like Mary Shelley might not have made it intentional, but it's there. Anyway, those are my thoughts on The Invisible Girl by Mary Shelley. A pretty interesting short story. Not my favorite from Mary Shelley, but I guess it's worth reading. I'll put a link to it in the description because it is in the public domain. If you read this before, or you simply want to comment on my review, comment below. Let's have a discussion about the short stories of Mary Shelley. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about those short stories. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and invisible travels. Farewell.